Every other week, we take a deeper look at the economics, policies, issues, and politics of the world's fastest growing region. This is our Asia 360 segment. And today we're heading over to Indonesia. Joining me for this conversation, Jeff Reeves, Vice President of Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Good morning.
Last segment, we talked about India, which is now embarking upon, I think, the largest democratic election process, although over many, many weeks. Indonesia this week had, I think it's the third largest democratic election in a single day. What were the results?
Well, so the early results see good news for the incumbent, Joko Widodo. It looks like he was reelected with somewhere between 7 and 8% of voters, or actually of a margin of 7 or 8% over Prabowo Subianto, who was his opposition. So it looks like there's going to be a continuation of leadership in Indonesia moving forward for the next 5 years.
And what is this a continuation of? What have we seen from the incumbent?
So Joko Widodo, who's known as Jokowi in Indonesia and mostly in the media, is a politician who ran on a platform of poverty reduction and investment in infrastructure. So some of the major things that he's done over the last couple of years are invest heavily in things like roads and connectivity. Indonesia is a nation state of about 17,000 islands. Mm-hmm. So one of the drives towards modernization that it needs to make is connecting those islands, connecting those population centers, moving towards urbanization, and providing social goods for people that have been outside of the state control for a very long time. So Jokowi ran on that. He said he would deliver about 7% growth for the time that he was in office. He's achieved about 5%, which is still very good for a developing economy, but there's a lot of opportunity in the Indonesian economy for further growth. And I think that this election shows that the Indonesian people have faith in Jokowi for being able to deliver that growth going forward.
For the Indonesian people, what was this election really about?
So I see this election as being about sort of three things. One, of course, is a referendum on Jokowi's performance. Mm-hmm. And to that end, I think that the voters came forward and said that they have faith in what he's done, that they're happy with some of the things he's done around poverty reduction, around the provision of healthcare, for example, to isolated communities, a move towards urbanization, the investment in fixed assets, roads, bridges, etc. On the other hand, I think there's another part of this election was around Indonesia's relationship with China. So this was actually also seen in the 2014 election between Prabowo and Jokowi. So the same two people ran against each other this time. Back then as well, one of the talking points around Prabowo's campaign was that Jokowi was a pro-Chinese politician, that he was too close to Beijing, that he supported minorities, the ethnic Indonesian minorities, more than he supported the Muslim majority. So about 88% of Indonesians are Muslim, but a small minority of Indonesians have Chinese ethnic backgrounds. So that was a charge that he had coming into the 2014 election, and one that was again played up in this election.
Diving into some of these a little bit more deeply, I'm curious, we've spoken before about the role of China in the region. Mm-hmm. Are accusations like that politicians are beholden to Beijing in some way becoming more and more common in politics?
It's not so much about Beijing's influence on the political process as it is concern about the accumulation of debt. So in 2018, Jokowi agreed to about $30 billion worth of Chinese investment into infrastructure development. What we saw was Prabowo coming forward and saying, this is just making us dependent on China. We need to worry about this. In many ways, we see that this same kind of dialogue coming around, for the example, the Malaysian elections, where there was a big concern about debt trap diplomacy, playing up this idea that China has using its economy kind of as a fifth column to get a buy-in or to get control over certain parts of the government. But really, at this point, it's just about becoming economically dependent and not having a diverse enough portfolio within the state's sovereign debt.
To what extent is this fear-mongering? To what extent is there maybe some validity to these concerns?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good fundamental question that a lot of developing countries that engage with Chinese loans and assistance are struggling with. Ultimately, I think, though, it becomes a question of governance within the country. These states, developing states in particular, whether in Africa or Southeast Asia, have long struggled with this idea of how to manage debt. It hasn't always been about how to manage Chinese debt, debt from the United States, debt from the European Union, just overall debt. And from a domestic perspective, this is not a China-specific issue, but a matter of governance. Can you take foreign debt? Can you take sovereign debt and manage it? So it's not so much about China, but more and more it's being shaped that way in Southeast Asia.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, of course, the religious aspect
Right.
and the impacts that has on culture and identity and politics in Indonesia. It's a very young population too. So I'm curious, maybe these competing forces of what in other parts of the world is a young and secular population
Right.
against maybe a long history of religion in the country.
So that would be the third component that I think this election was about the role of Islam in Indonesian politics and in Indonesian society. So Jokowi was for a long time seen as not being Islamic enough. He is a practicing Muslim, but he's seen as also being quite sympathetic to other minorities in the country, and for a long time was portrayed by his opposition as being a Muslim in name only. Whereas Prabowo pushed forward this idea of a very robust Indonesian Muslim identity built around nationalism, a national identity, embracing the role of Islam in Indonesian politics and society. So you had these two competing views, one kind of based around a more modern interpretation of Islam and one based around more of a traditional interpretation. Jokowi must have felt the pressure at a certain point because he did decide a couple of weeks ago to choose a running mate that is a Muslim cleric and head of one of the larger Muslim organizations in Indonesia, a 75-year-old man. What we saw here was, again, some tension. As you mentioned, Indonesia is a very young country. About 30% of the population is under 14. About 70 million new voters in this election, new voters meaning they're voting for the first time, between 16 and 20 years old, were coming out. So that's about a third of total Indonesian voters. So on the one hand, Jokowi had to appeal to the youth vote. On the other hand, he had to appeal to the Muslim vote. And at least it seems that he made the rationale to privilege the Muslim vote over the youth vote, even though he had a chance of alienating the youth vote with a 75-year-old a Muslim cleric picked for his running mate.
Fair enough. Like my question about the role of China or foreign governments in the region, what's the role of religion in countries in Southeast Asia at this point in time?
Well, Indonesia's long been seen as a more moderate Muslim country. In fact, it's been pointed to by states in the West for a long time as an example of what Islamic modernization could look like. And this was an important part of the narrative, especially immediately after September 11th, where there was an attempt by Western nations to understand global movements within the broader Islamic world. Whereas the Middle East was seen as moving towards a more conservative adoption of Islam, Southeast Asia was seen as one of the last places where Islam was moving in sort of a modern direction.
Indonesia is a force in the region. It has such a big population. What's its role in terms of facilitating things like trade or economic partnerships within Southeast Asia?
So under Jokowi, Indonesia pursued its kind of standard foreign policy engagement strategy, which is built around kind of two different pillars. One being a commitment to non-alignment. So Indonesia was one of the first states to move towards non-alignment. So actually the 1955 Bandung Conference, where India, China, and Indonesia and other self-described third world countries came together and said, rather than pick a side in the Cold War, we're going to have an independent foreign policy going forward. And that idea of non-alignment stays, I think, pretty central to what Indonesia's done. On the other side, you have Indonesian engagement with ASEAN being the other side of its foreign policy approach in Southeast Asia with regards to trade, with regard to security. There's been a hope that Indonesia would step up and actually have a leadership role within ASEAN. And what we've actually seen is that rather than doing that, Indonesia's used ASEAN to essentially kind of pass the buck in terms of its leadership responsibilities. So it's looked for ASEAN, for example, to take the lead on foreign policy issues where it's not really what ASEAN does. And it would be more natural for Indonesia, being the largest country within ASEAN, to take that role. So we see these kind of tensions within Indonesian foreign policy. Jokowi has actually been much more pragmatic. There's been a hope, again, that Indonesia could lead on debates around, for example, security in the South China Sea or the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, or having a position that could become an ASEAN position on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. But it hasn't. It's chosen to stay away from those controversial issues and focus more on having a foreign policy built around achieving domestic goals, like getting investment in infrastructure, etc.
Fair enough. For other ASEAN members, would they be comfortable with Indonesia taking over that leadership position? What are those relationships like?
I think there's an acceptance within Southeast Asia that Indonesia, just because of the size of its population, you're looking at 260 million people, is a natural leader within the Southeast Asian context. I think they would look to have ASEAN have a restraining role to a degree on Indonesia being able to, for example, have unilateral action in the South China Sea. But it is seen as an important, probably the most important state within ASEAN in terms of not only its present position, but its future growth. So I think the World Bank has said by 2030, Indonesia will be the 7th largest economy in the world. It'll be bigger than the United Kingdom. It'll be bigger than Germany. And if you think about the demographics, as you said, the youth bulge in Indonesia, all of this potential, there's a really significant chance that Indonesia will emerge as the most important sub-regional actor in Southeast Asia.
So the country should be on our radar here in Canada.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting country in that respect, because rather than adopt the traditional development model that other Asian states have, which is a very export-driven model, they'll develop their own domestic industries and export to the United States or the European Union or other advanced economies. A lot of Indonesia's growth for the last couple of decades has come on domestic consumption and improvements in productivity. So there's a lot of opportunity within the existing the existing Indonesian model for further growth along those lines.
Is Canada on Indonesia's radar?
I would say marginally. Indonesia is on Canada's radar. So as of 2018, Indonesia was the second largest destination for Canadian foreign direct investment into Asia, about $2.8 billion in 2018. Bilateral trade between the two countries was about 1.1 billion Indonesian imports into Canada and about 1.3 billion exports from Canada to Indonesia. So not a significant amount of economic exchange, but certainly a lot of opportunity. When you think, for example, about Canadian pension funds and where they're looking to put their money, a lot of that has been in places like Mexico and Brazil around, for example, roads, toll roads, and hydropower. Both of those things are in desperate demand in Indonesia. So you could think of an opportunity for the pension funds to invest there. Jokowi has said that he needs about $400 billion in external funding for their internal infrastructure development plans. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity there. I think food security is another area where Canada could engage more closely with Indonesia. It's a major issue in Indonesia right now. They're about 60% away from their own domestic capabilities around agriculture to be able to feed their own population. So they have to import 60% of the entire food stock that goes to the Indonesian people.
Wow.
So Canada has a great opportunity there to expand its exports of wheat, of soy. Canola is a natural export, in particular because it's halal. And with an 88% population, a lot of cooking in Indonesia actually doesn't use lard or fat, but does rely on that kind of vegetable extract. And canola would have a great opportunity in that market.
For Canadian businesses looking to explore this market further, what are some things that would be prudent for them to keep in mind about doing business in Indonesia?
That it's a developing country, and outside of the urban centers, it's going to be a challenge to engage. That said, there's a huge push in Indonesia for urbanization. So there are going to be opportunities around providing services in that respect. If you're thinking about urban management, if you're thinking about introducing energy efficiency into that kind of calculation, I think there's opportunity. The other is that Indonesia has a significant growing middle class. Again, I think with reference to that World Bank report, by 2030, we should have another 100 million individuals in Indonesia that are middle class, and they'll be consuming goods. And there's a huge opportunity for Canadian exporters to Indonesia to meet those consumer demands.
Why haven't we seen Indonesia part of the CPTPP?
I think internal regulatory environment in Indonesia is still underdeveloped. That's one area, for example, when we talk about how Indonesia could be more effective moving forward in economic development, where there is opportunity. If Indonesia needs to deal with its own internal regulatory environment before it can enter into a CPTPP type multilateral organization, which really is focused on bringing kind of higher standards. Indonesia is not quite there yet in terms of regulatory environments around its agricultural industry, around other industries that were a key part of the CPTPP negotiations.
Jeff, as always, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming with your insight.
Thanks so much.
That's Jeff Reeves, Vice President of Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada.